good people. So today I had the idea I want to relay a point, combining a couple ideas with like amodal perception and fourth path enlightenment, and why it is that once you get to fourth path, why does your experience become so airy, so holographic? Like everything is just so much lighter and smoother, and as Shinzen Young says, feather light, paper thin. Why would that be the case? And I think what's a potential explanation for this is seeing through the guise of amodal perception. What is amodal perception? Amodal perception is when you don't directly experience something, but the mind heavily infers its existence, and in such a way that it shapes your behavior. You're going to act in the world and behave in the world and talk as if you are experiencing this thing, but actually you're not. It's just inferred. It's out of eyesight. So for example, I'll give a couple examples. So you're walking down the street and there's a bend in the road, there's a corner that goes around the other side of a building. You can't see around the corner, but your priors are such that there's a lot of weighting in a sort of a predictive model that is assuming the world does continue around this corner, and then there's more road to become, and more buildings there. If you walk around the corner, you're not surprised to find more world, more road, and more buildings. And this could be an example of amodal perception. When you walk around the corner, you weren't expecting just a void to be there, or like suddenly it's a desert, or a waterfall, just a big chasm, right, if you're walking in a street or something like this. So always kind of making these predictive assumptions about what is kind of outside of direct experience. Another example, so you see this notebook here. From one point of view, you can't see back around the other side of the notebook, but if I show you the other side, you're not surprised that there is a back to this notebook. Again, you weren't expecting there to be an elephant around the back of this notebook. And you will behave in the world in such a way that even though you can't directly experience the back of the notebook, you're assuming this is a fully voluminous sort of concrete structure that has its boundaries and its substantial existence in the world. Another thing we do is we predict the weightiness of objects. So, just based on past experience and such, when you go to reach for an object, in order to kind of predict how much force you should use when you pick it up, you're simulating in your head how much you think it's likely to weigh. So, only use the appropriate amount of energy to pick this up. And if you're wrong, sometimes this happens. You think something's going to be heavier than it is, and you use too much energy. You're like, whoa, okay, readjust. Or something's lighter. No, you think something's going to be lighter than it is, and you're like, oh, okay, got to use more force. Pick up. Other examples of amodal perception where the mind fills in the gap is like this Necker cube illusion, where you've got basically just like the corners of a cube, but the lines that connect the corners together are erased. And when you first look at this, your mind just sees a cube, even though actually you have to take a minute and stop and go, oh no, there isn't actually a cube. There are just some diagonal corners and such, but the mind fills in the gap. We've got a lot of these little kind of tricks that consciousness does for efficiency reasons and practical reasons, such as there's the blind spot in the visual field, that actually there's some kind of spot where the two overlapping percepts of the visual field, well, they don't overlap at some point, and yet we don't perceive a blank spot in our visual field. It's all, one big unified visual field. The mind has to fill in the gap there, but there's ways to kind of find the visual blind spot. Okay, so then how does this relate to some of the insights that you get along the meditative path leading up to enlightenment that make all the difference? So it's not like when you're enlightened, you're constantly aware of the visual blind spot. No, luckily it's not like you need to figure out all the tricks and gimmicks and stuff of this, but there are major ones that you see through there, the illusion of them, and you kind of permanently see through them, such that there are certain insights you get where once you've seen through these illusions, they never pop up again. And then there are other aspects of the mind that they can continue to arise, but now you're never fully bought into them. Even though they continue to arise, you have an insight into their empty nature, such that, okay, the Necker cube, for example, once you know the trick, you realize there's no cube there. You realize the mind is filling in the gap, and you're never fully deceived by it. Or there are gradations here where you're deceived, not deceived, deceived, not deceived, deceived, not deceived, deceived, not deceived, and that can be part of the meditative journey as well. Of self, no self, self, no self, self, no self, self, no self. So yeah, then leading on to, okay, what are some of these amodal perceptions that you got to see through them in order to awaken spiritually? And I think this contends with sense of self, sense of boundaries to a mind, sense of there being an inside and an outside, sense of agency and free will, and these kind of things. So sense of there being a center point to the mind where you never actually perceive them. They're amodally perceived. They're inferred. They're kind of just in the periphery. So a sense of a boundary to the mind. And the shape of people's mind can change. It can be this amorphous structure, but eventually you get out of a shape to this in some sense. But for a lot of people, you've got the visual field that's, I think, a little bit wider than 180 degrees even. But at some point, it clearly ends. So when you get to the periphery, the visual space becomes a lot less clear. There's less detail. Things are just fuzzy objects, and they actually lose their color. And you notice you could take something that's like brightly colored, put it into your periphery, and if you're being really honest about your perception, you go, oh, it's actually, maybe you know what color it is because you saw it beforehand, but if you're trying to look directly at your raw experience, it's like, oh, this is actually kind of a murky, gray fuzz thing. So when the visual field ends here, you try to track your awareness round and round and round. For a lot of people, it will then start to like link up with somatic sensations in the head, and then they'll construct this sort of semicircular space, which they perceive, oh, this is the shape of my mind. It goes around here, but actually, just because the visual field as it ends, and then you move awareness back, and now suddenly you start tracking somatic sensations around the back of your head. If you can notice that trick, you can decouple somatic sensations from the edge of the visual field, and you got to get the insight that that is actually not objectively indicative of the shape of your mind. Just because you feel a hardness here, and then the end of the visual field, you feel like, oh, that's a hard boundary of my mind, when really it's not. It's just more sensations. It's all just sensations. Same goes for the sense of self. So another kind of object of the mind, people have this sort of torus-like structure where there's this hollowed out middle, and there's this yeah, there's the solid structure of the self, sort of down the middle line here. Well, if you go to look for that, you just find sensations. And then there's an attributing more specialness to these sensations than what they're actually worth. Like, why are these sensations here somehow more special than a sensation here or here? And yet these sensations are given, promoted to the rank of, well, like I say, the puppet dictator of consciousness, this sort of single epistemic agent that thinks it's running the show when really it's not. And yeah, just with the amodal perception, it's heavily inferred. So you never directly perceive the solid sort of singly persisting self, and then when you go to look for it, you don't find it, and yet there's a sense that, oh, it's just heavily inferred. So just as, imagine you walk into a room and there's this column in the middle of the room, or so you think there's a column in the middle of the room. So actually there isn't a column in the middle of the room, but you amodally perceive it. And you're going to walk into this room and you're going to act like there is this pillar in the middle of the room, and you will walk round it. It's not actually there, but you're going to act like it is. You'll walk around it, and then when people say, "Oh, why did you not just walk straight through the room? Why did you sort of take this detour?" And you go, "Oh, well, there's a big column there. I had to walk around it." And you go, "Where is it?" And you go, "Oh, it's just there." And you go, "No, look for it." And if you actually go to look for it, you don't find it, and you turn back and you're like, "Well, yeah, but it must be there." A similar kind of trick is happening with the self. And so eventually you've got to keep looking, and get enough clear data, having sharpened your concentration skills, attentional clarity, equanimity, metacognition, to look and get the clear data and be like, okay, I've really looked. Now I have to update my sense of the parameters of this room. There is no column there. And then you do this, drawing an analogy with the mind. There is no middle column in the mind, a center or a stable self. And then your mind can just stop representing that. And then you can walk straight through the room. The things just glide in the mind without being hindered by a rock solid sort of self that's got to sort of keep its fortress, keep its boundaries up. It's like sensations and information just glides around. Now, okay, another thing I talked about, the weightiness is another kind of amodal perception. So you don't directly experience it when you're just detecting objects, but it's heavily inferred. Same goes for the sense of the body and body sensations and all these things. And part of the reason why, once you get to this sort of decentralized mind at fourth path, just everything becomes kind of holographic and so airy thin, is because it's like you've no longer got the amodal perception of inferring, okay, I feel a sensation, and therefore that reifies the existence of hard, muscle and bone and these things. And it's just, you just take the sensation as it is, or the body's schema is really understood to be really sort of gaseous sensations appearing and disappearing. And a cool analogy here is like with video games. If you're, say you're playing a third person video game, and you can rotate the camera sort of into a wall, and the camera angle sort of clips the wall, and whereas before there was this 3D generated landscape or map, say, and your character's sort of running around it and jumping on it, and it looks hard. But then as soon as you sort of pull this sort of glitch where you sort of move the camera into the wall, and it clips the wall, and goes through the wall, you're left with you seeing the hollowness of all of that structure. That actually, to make a video game, you only need to create a ground for the player to run on that is just not even an inch deep. Right? You don't actually need to be procedurally rendering a solid ground, that goes miles deep into the ground, underground. It's not necessary. This would be a waste of computational power. So then it can burst the delusion that you're running in a 3D hardened space. It's really tantamount with your world simulation, with the phenomenal world in which you perceive and live in. So there's this video actually of Leo Gura speaking to this point in some way, in one of his really old videos, where it's my enlightenment experience explained, I think, where he's talking about how he's looking at a tree and then he's taking the raw data just at first-hand value of seeing but it's not actually, I'm just seeing the face of a tree in the distance on hills, I think. And it's assumed that that's a thick, solid structure. But you don't get to see inside the tree. You don't get to see any background, or how deep the walls go, how deep the tree goes. You can come to see that all of this is really light. It's actually all really, really light. I mean, it's impossibly thin. All of these sensations. But then there's that amodal perception, that heavy inference of their thickness, their solidity. When actually, if you're really true to your direct experience, you don't perceive that. Yes, and then that goes for the body, and you just start experiencing your body as just this really light thing that is hollow. And that goes into speaking to seeing more and more the empty nature of all of this. It's all procedurally rendered and in your world simulation. But I think if there's a few other points I want to make about this. But yeah, so I mean, just the amodal perception, I think it applies to a sense of the boundary of the mind. So you think you can map sort of a spatial shape to your mind. Oh, it's for a lot of people in the beginner's mind, it's this sense that, okay, the mind is in here, and then I close my eyes, and there's this inside and this outside, and then you inspect that inside and outside, and find that that's not to be the case. And then people can get to the stage where they feel like, okay, I'm in this bubble of the mind. But that sense of the boundaries of the mind, again, they're not indicative of the objective shape of the mind. Those are just appearing in the mind space as well, those sense of boundaries, and they can appear and disappear. And then you can see through them as to, oh, actually, I'm just coupling visual stimuli with sensations in the head. And once you decouple those, just sensations are just sensations. And since there's no sensation that's more important than any other sensation of giving you a true rendition of who's in control, or what the structure of this mind is, or how it's shaped. It's all heavily inferred. The same with the sense of a center point to the mind. To a degree, you don't actually perceive a center. You think you do, but it's a type of amodal perception. You got to keep looking around the back of the book where you don't directly experience it. Go test it out. Is there a back of the book? Is there a center? Are there boundaries? Is there a self? You keep looking, and you actually find a void. You actually find, oh, hang on, the world does end. Walk around the corner and the world ends. That's a lot what it's like. And then at some point, you get enough data on these things, the mind has to update its whole model perception of itself and realize, oh, those things were actually never there to begin with. I was mistaken. And then you're left with this, just decentralized, centerless mind, no perceived boundaries, super airy, thin. You're not perceiving a hard, solid body, and no self. And it's great. It's so good. It's so good, guys. Honestly, like, get this. The well-being is just up top. So I think I probably covered most of what I wanted to say, and probably missed some key points, but that can be talked about another time.